In 2014, Vladimir Putin took Crimea in 4 weeks, almost without firing a shot. He called the peninsula Sacred Land, an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It was the biggest trophy of his government, proof that Russia had become an empire again. 12 years later, that trophy is turning into a trap. And the most impressive thing is how Ukraine is not sending tanks. They're not invading by land. They found something much simpler and much harder to stop. They're turning Crimea into an island, cutting off the bridges, sinking the ferries, choking the roads, drying up the fuel, and taking control of the sea and the sky around the peninsula one by one. The idea is cruel in its simplicity. Crimea will not fall in a big tank attack. It will become too expensive to hold, impossible to supply, impossible to defend, impossible to live in. This compilation explains the decline in 3 parts. First, the big picture. Why is Crimea the key to the whole war? And how was the most powerful fleet in the Black Sea driven out of there? Then, the chokehold. The 3 arteries that connect the peninsula to Russia being cut one by one until the gas stations in Sevastopol run out of fuel. And finally, the sky. The most unlikely weapon of the whole war, which is piercing the most expensive anti-aircraft defense on the planet. That leads to an uncomfortable question. How long can Putin still hold on to his most precious jewel before the Russian soldiers inside are the last to find out they've been left alone? Let's start with the big picture. June 3rd, 2025, 4:44 in the morning. At the bottom of the Kerch Strait, Ukrainian agents spent months doing something no one should be able to do. They planted bombs under Russia's most heavily guarded bridge. That bridge cost nearly $4 billion. The bridge was inaugurated by Putin himself, driving a truck. And when the detonator was triggered, 1,100 kilos of TNT exploded on the support pillars. But if you think that was the big part of the story, you still haven't understood what's going on, because that explosion was just one piece. A small piece of a much bigger plan that's been in the works for years. And now, in 2026, it's finally reaching its final stage. Ukraine is doing something in Crimea that no one thought was possible, and Putin knows it, but he can't stop it anymore. The question is, how? How is a country with almost no navy defeating one of the world's strongest fleets? And why can't Putin, with his entire army, fight back anymore? The answer is more unsettling than you might think. To understand what's happening now, you need to go back 12 years. February of 2014. Vladimir Putin took advantage of a moment of political chaos in Kiev. He sent unmarked troops to Crimea. In less than 4 weeks, he took over the entire peninsula, almost without firing a shot. Putin said that was the greatest achievement of his administration. He said that Crimea was sacred land, that it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Black Sea. And he was right about one thing. Crimea is not just any piece of land. It's from there that Russia controls the entire Black Sea. It's from Sevastopol, Russia's main naval base in Crimea, that the Russian fleet sets out. It's from Crimea that the missiles are launched which fall on Kiev, Odessa, and Nikolaev. And there's more. At the bottom of the Black Sea, in waters that belonged to Ukraine until 2014, there are natural gas reserves valued at hundreds of billions of dollars. When Putin took Crimea, he didn't just take a piece of land. He took 80% of the Black Sea's energy reserves, which belong to Ukraine. The truth is, whoever controls Crimea controls half the war. That's why, when the full-scale invasion began in 2022, Crimea became the base of everything. Troops, ammunition, fuel, missiles, everything went through there. But what Putin didn't imagine was that Ukraine was watching, studying, waiting, and preparing something that would take Russia years to understand. The first clue appeared a few months after the large-scale invasion. In 2022, Ukrainian drones began to appear over Sevastopol. Small, cheap, almost improvised. They would hit a ship here, a base there. The Russians called them isolated incidents. The world press barely reported it. But the attacks didn't stop. In 2023, Ukraine did something unprecedented. An operation that it called the Crab Trap. Ukraine launched Storm Shadow cruise missiles manufactured by England and France against the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, right in the middle of a command meeting. At least 9 Russian officers were killed. There were generals among them. The historic building, a symbol of Russian naval power since the days of the Soviet Union, was left in ruins. Back in 2022, Ukrainian missiles had sunk the cruiser Moskva, the most important ship in the Russian fleet. In 2023 and 2024, it was the turn of other ships and submarines to be hit inside their own ports. Planes destroyed on the runway, air defense systems wiped off the map. And at some point between 2024 and 2025, something happened that no one expected. The Black Sea Fleet, one of the oldest and most powerful fleets in the world, which Prince Potemkin founded in 1783, fled. It abandoned Sevastopol, the base that served as home to the Russian Navy for more than 200 years. Russia pulled its ships back to Novorossiysk on the other side of the Black Sea, in actual Russian territory. It was the first time in modern history that a navy was driven from the sea by a country that didn't even have a navy. And this is where the story starts to get really disturbing for Russia, because what you're about to understand isn't just about a peninsula. It's about how an invaded nation with far fewer resources than the invader is rewriting the rules of modern warfare. Without nuclear submarines, no aircraft carriers, no US military budget, just brains, patience, and drones. And that was just the beginning. Let's go back to June 3rd, 2025. 4:44 in the morning. The bridge over the Kerch Strait is 19 kilometers long. It's the longest bridge in Europe. And for Putin, it was more than just a bridge. It was a symbol. The physical proof that Crimea was now Russian forever.
Поехали. Путь.
In 2018, he made a point of inaugurating it himself by personally driving a Kamaz truck in front of cameras from all over the world. After 2022, that bridge became something else. It became the main artery supplying the Russian army in southern Ukraine. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, troops. Everything passed through there. That's why it had already been attacked before. In October 2022, a truck bomb brought down parts of the road. In July 2023, sea drones with 850 kilos of explosives each exploded under another pillar. The Russians repaired, reinforced, and armored it. They deployed sonar in the water. They set up patrols, they put up protective nets, they thought they were safe. But Ukrainian intelligence, led by a man named Vasyl Malyuk, was already carrying out another operation, one that lasted for months. Ukrainian agents went into the water dozens of times in complete secrecy. They planted explosives directly on the underwater support pillars, pillar by pillar, charge by charge, without being detected. 1,100 kilos of TNT in total, the equivalent of a large aerial bomb, but divided into small pieces, hidden under the water, waiting for the signal. When the signal came on that June 3rd, the bridge shook. The pillars were damaged, the structure cracked. Back in 2024, an agent of Ukrainian intelligence, identified only by the codename Hunter, had given a public warning. He said it very clearly: the Crimean bridge is doomed. And on June 3rd, 2025, he proved he was serious. And what came after that, in 2026, proved that the bridge wasn't the only thing that was doomed. 2026. The war entered its 5th year. And in Crimea, something changed. The attacks stopped seeming like isolated events. They became a sequence, a chain of connected operations where each chosen target prepared the next one. April 5th, 2026. Ukrainian military intelligence launched drones at night against a Russian ferry called Slavyanin. It may seem like an unimportant target, but it wasn't. The Slavyanin was the last railway ferry still operating in the Kerch Strait. The last one. It was the one carrying fuel, ammunition, and heavy equipment for the Russians in Crimea. Whenever the bridge was overloaded or compromised. When Slavyanin caught fire on the water, Russia lost Plan B. 20 days later, April 26th, Sevastopol. In a single night, Ukrainian Special Forces commandos hit 3 warships at the same time. The landing ship Yamal, the Filchenkov, and the Ivan Kurs, an intelligence ship. At a nearby airbase called Belbek, they destroyed an elite Russian fighter jet on the runway, one of those that cost tens of millions of dollars. An advanced radar knocked out, a naval training center hit, all in a single night. And it wasn't just in Sevastopol. A few weeks earlier, on the other side of the Black Sea in Novorossiysk, the Russian port where the Black Sea Fleet had taken refuge, Ukrainian drones had already attacked as well. The minesweeper ship Valentin Pikul sunk. 2 frigates, which are large Russian warships, were damaged. The Russian submarines started doing something that no one had ever seen before. They began to dive inside their own ports. Not to hide from the enemy at sea, to hide from drones that come from the sky. The Black Sea Fleet today is what military analysts call a ghost fleet. It exists on paper, but it can't go out anymore. It can't attack anymore. It can hardly defend anything anymore. And in the middle of the Kerch Strait, Putin's bridge is still standing, wounded, hastily repaired, guarded like never before, but with each passing day more isolated. Every ferry destroyed, every ship sunk. Every base hit tightens the noose. Crimea is turning into an island. And on an island surrounded by drones, no one survives for long. Now, to really understand the scale of what's happening, it's worth listening to what a man named Ben Hodges says. Hodges is a retired lieutenant general of the United States Army. He commanded all American forces in Europe. He spent almost 40 years in uniform. And since 2022, he has been repeating the same phrase in interviews, on podcasts, at military conferences. The phrase is this: Crimea is the decisive terrain in this war. For Hodges, everything that happens in Donetsk, in Luhansk, in Zaporizhzhia is important. But it's secondary. Because as long as Russia controls Crimea, Ukraine will never be safe. It will never be able to rebuild its economy. It will never be able to export grain through the Black Sea while Putin can still decide from the peninsula to block its ports. Hodges said in 2025 very clearly, that bridge is gonna fall. For him, it's just a matter of time. And in 2026, he went even further. He said that Ukraine still doesn't need to send ground troops to the peninsula. It doesn't need a classic invasion, it just needs one thing: to make Crimea untenable. Impossible to defend, impossible to supply, impossible for Russian soldiers to live there. And as you yourself saw, that's exactly what's happening. Now think about what that means for Putin. Crimea was the greatest political victory of his government. It was the foundation of all Russian propaganda for more than a decade. If Crimea falls, it's not just a peninsula that falls. The entire story that Putin tells the Russian people falls as well. The justification for the war falls. The most strategic military base that Russia has outside of Russia itself falls. And along with it, the myth that Putin is the man who rebuilt the empire falls. That's why Russia is reinforcing its positions. That's why it's building hardened aircraft shelters in Belbek. That's why it's moving resources needed elsewhere to try to hold the peninsula. But there's a problem. In March 2026, Russia lost more soldiers in a single month than in any other month since the beginning of the war. 35,000 soldiers killed or wounded, For the first time in almost 4 years, Russia is losing more soldiers than it can recruit. And that changes everything. Because an army that can't replenish itself can't defend two fronts at the same time. So the question remains, what do you think will happen? Will Russia be able to protect this bridge for much longer? Look, the truth is that nobody knows the date, nobody knows the exact month, but the direction is clear. Even Russian military analysts, those who write on blogs linked to the Russian government, have already quietly admitted that something has changed. The bridge is still standing but wounded. Repairs are becoming more frequent, more and more expensive. And military experts agree on one thing: the fourth attack is just a matter of time. If it comes in the right form, with the right technology, at the right time, the bridge will fall. And when it falls, there's no way to rebuild it in the middle of a war. Not with Ukrainian drones watching the Strait 24 hours a day. The ferries are already gone. The ships are hidden. The submarines submerge in their own ports. The air bases are being reinforced with concrete, not to attack, but to survive. And meanwhile, inside Crimea, something quiet begins to unfold. The Russian soldiers serving on the peninsula are in a place that could at any moment be cut off from the world. Cut off from Russia. And when that happens, they'll be the last to know. In 2014, Putin took Crimea in 4 weeks, barely firing a shot. At that time, he believed he had conquered the peninsula forever, that he had rebuilt the empire, that he had redrawn the map of Europe. 12 years later, he is finding out how wrong he was. This siege has a name on the battlefield: logistical strangulation. And it's already hurting where it hurts the most, at the gas pump in Sevastopol. Look at what's left of the only 3 arteries that keep Crimea alive.
Здравствуйте, товарищи!
Vladimir Putin is about to lose the most important conquest of his entire administration. In 2014, he took Crimea almost without firing a shot. It was the greatest victory of Putin's reign. The trophy that proved to the world that Russia had become an empire again. And now, 12 years later, that same trophy is turning into his biggest trap. The way this is happening is what scares the Russian government the most. Because it's not being done with tanks. It's not through an invasion. It's with something that Russia simply isn't able to stop. And you can see that in a very specific place. Crimea is running out of fuel. In Sevastopol, the largest city on the peninsula, the gas stations opened with a limit: 20 liters per car. And a few days later, not even the 20 liters were available anymore. The gasoline simply ran out. At the end of May, the very governor that Russia installed in the city admitted that regular gasoline had run out. The 2 most commonly used types simply disappeared from the pumps. In a land that Russia took as a trophy more than 10 years ago, people started lining up for fuel that is no longer being delivered. And here's the key detail: the reason isn't an invasion. No Ukrainian tank crossed the Crimean border, no soldier set foot there. What is suffocating the peninsula is something much harder to solve and much smarter. Because Ukraine found a way to take back Crimea without needing to invade. And Russia, for the first time in 12 years, is not able to stop it. For you to understand how big this is, you need to remember what Crimea means. When Putin took the peninsula in 2014, he treated it as the jewel of his government. It was proof that Russia had become an empire again. And when the real invasion began in 2022, Crimea became the base of everything. That was where the troops, missiles, and bombers attacking southern Ukraine came from. For years, it was untouchable, a fortress, but every fortress has a weak point, and Crimea's has always been the same. It is almost an island. Everything that keeps the Russian soldiers there, fuel, ammunition, parts, food, everything has to come from outside. There were only 3 routes for it to get there. 3 arteries. The first one is the most famous in the world. The Kerch Bridge. And the damage wasn't just to the structure, it was to confidence. Even when the bridge is standing, the Russians have become afraid to use it. Today, satellite images analyzed by a Ukrainian intelligence agency show something revealing. Between February and April of this year, no Russian military cargo train crossed the bridge. None. Traffic dropped to a handful of passenger trains and a single regular freight train per day. That is, Russia itself stopped trusting its own bridge to move military equipment. Commanders avoid taking heavy armored vehicles through there, fearing that the already damaged structure might give way, or that a new attack might bring everything down at once. The symbol of conquest is now a place no one wants to use. So, there were two paths left, and this is where the story starts to speed up. The second option was the ferries. Rail ferries that crossed the Kerch Strait, carrying what the bridge could no longer carry. They were enormous ships. The largest of them, the Slavyanin, was 150 meters long and carried entire train cars full of fuel and ammunition from one shore to the other. It was the silent alternative. Then, Ukraine started hunting these ferries, one by one. First, the Avant-Garde in March, and then in the early morning of April 6th, the last one. Ukrainian military intelligence sent drones against the Slavyanin and released the thermal images. The ship catching fire in the middle of the sea. With it, the second artery was gone. Russia had just lost the ability to transport heavy cargo to Crimea by sea. Notice what was happening. With each route that was lost, Russia became more dependent on what was still left. And what was left now was just one road. The last artery was by land, a highway that cuts through the entire occupied south of Ukraine. It comes from Russia, from a city called Rostov, and goes down to Crimea, passing through Mariupol, Berdyansk, and Melitopol. On the Russian map, they even gave it a new name, New Russia Route. And for years, this road worked. It was long, far from the front line, and most importantly, it was out of reach of Ukrainian drones. Tanks, fuel, troops, everything passed through there with a certain level of safety. It was Crimea's lifeline. This is where everything changes, because this road was no longer out of reach. And it's worth stopping for a second here, because this is the heart of the whole story. For almost the entire war, Ukrainian drones were short-range. The famous FPVs, those attack drones you see in videos, hit targets about 20 kilometers from the front. And that highway was more than 100 kilometers away. Too far away. But Ukraine didn't just learn how to wage war with drones. It has come to master it. New models have appeared with medium and long range. One of them, called Hornet, uses artificial intelligence to find its target and can reach up to about 150 kilometers. And the long-range ones, the FP1 and FP2, reach 200. Suddenly, the road that used to be safe became the most dangerous place in the entire occupied South. And it wasn't by chance. At the end of May, Ukraine gave a name to what it had been doing in secret. A program to block Russian logistics with $113 million invested in the best drone teams. According to Ukraine's Minister of Defense, the goal was to choke Russia's rear lines. Not to face the army head-on, to cut off what feeds that army. And the number he gave is impressive. According to the minister, Ukraine has quadrupled the destruction of Russian trucks, depots, and convoys with these medium-range attacks. And the result, the Russians themselves named it. They call it the Road of Death. Russian military bloggers, people who support Russia, started posting images of burned trucks along the highway. One of them compared it to the roads in Afghanistan in the 80s, vehicle wrecks scattered along the shoulder. Another wrote that that stretch was no longer a rear area. And look, it's not Ukraine saying this. It's the Russian side in a panic describing their own collapse. Now combine everything with the image from the start. The gas stations without fuel in Sevastopol. When you cut off all 3 arteries at the same time, Crimea stops getting supplied, and the people there feel it immediately. Fuel that doesn't arrive means troops that can't move, armored vehicles that stay put, and that shows up on the battlefield. According to the Ukrainian defense minister, the price Russia pays for every kilometer it tries to advance has skyrocketed. In October, it was 67 soldiers lost per kilometer. In April, 179. Without supplies, each meter costs more. And it doesn't stop with the military. In the city, gasoline started to run out even for regular cars. The line at the gas station doesn't move. The bottleneck stopped being a military theory and became a problem at the gas pump. But the most important part is still missing. And it comes down to one question. After all, why doesn't Russia just solve this? And the answer to that question is revealing. Because there is a known defense against drones. Ukraine itself uses it, and it works. It's nets. Huge screens, sometimes made from fishing nets stretched over wooden poles, covering the road like a tunnel. They catch the drone before it hits the vehicle below. In one section, after Ukraine installed these nets, no Russian drone got through. It works so well that Ukraine is covering thousands of kilometers of roads with them. So the question is obvious. Why doesn't Russia cover the Crimean road the same way? And this is where the size of the hole Russia has gotten itself into becomes clear. Russian bloggers have been begging for these nets for weeks. Asking for nets, asking for electronic warfare, asking for protection. And so far, almost nothing has shown up. The governor of the occupied region even signed a decree. But the decree only banned civilian trucks, and it left the military exposed just the same. A blogger connected to the Russian government complained that this only made things easier for Ukrainian drones, which now didn't even need to distinguish between what was civilian and what was military. In other words, it's one of two things. Either Russia can no longer deploy defenses there because the logistics that would bring the nets are exactly what's being destroyed, or it has already quietly decided that Crimea is no longer a priority. And either of those answers is devastating for Putin. One says he can't do it. The other says he gave up. And while Russia stammers, Ukraine is already moving on to the next stage. With fewer supplies arriving, the peninsula's air defenses are being destroyed without replacement. And these aren't cheap systems. Ukraine has already hit S-300 and S-400 batteries in Crimea, Russia's most advanced air defense systems, each capable of covering hundreds of kilometers of airspace. They hit Nebo-U radars, a Panzer system at the Belbek airfield, and even MiG-31 fighter jets on the ground. A German analysis calculated that between March and May alone, Ukraine destroyed 37 Russian air defense, radar, and electronic warfare systems. More than double what it had destroyed in the previous months. The Ukrainian Navy said that the Russian Black Sea Fleet hardly goes out to sea. And every defense that falls opens a bigger gap for the next attack. Crimea, which for years shot at anything that came close, has become, in the words of a Ukrainian analyst, an easy target. And Russia even has a plan to escape this. They are hastily building a new railway of almost 700 kilometers, connecting Rostov to the occupied cities like Melitopol by a route farther from the coast. The idea is to create a new, more protected supply route. The problem is time. This railroad takes months to be completed, and the siege is tightening now. And that's why the central idea of this story is as simple as it is cruel. Crimea won't fall to a tank attack. It's going to become too expensive to hold. It will be strangled until keeping it costs more than it's worth. And think about what that means for the rest of the war. The peninsula that supplied the entire Russian offensive in the south now drains resources instead of sending them. The trophy has become a burden. The base has turned into a trap. And there's something almost ironic about all of this. Putin took Crimea in 2014 almost without firing a shot. It was a quick surgical operation that the world took a while to understand. 12 years later, it may be slipping away in exactly the same way. No invasion, no major battle. Just the slow and steady squeeze of someone who cut off every route back. What seemed like a permanent conquest turned out to be fragile. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable lesson of this war. For anyone who thinks that conquering territory is the same as keeping it forever. This is still happening. Every week, the siege tightens a little more. Cutting off fuel and road access is strangling Crimea by land and by sea. But the skies were still the missing piece. And that's when Ukraine unleashed the most unlikely weapon of the entire war. A drone that, instead of fleeing from Russian defenses, shoots back. Russia spent 4 years building an invisible wall over its own territory. Layer upon layer of defense designed for a single obsession: to shoot down Ukrainian drones before they reach their target. It was 4 years of radars, missiles, electronic warfare, and in the end, flesh and blood men spread out on the ground. And then, on a night in May last year, over occupied Crimea, a single cheap drone did something that brought down that entire wall. The drone didn't do what they expected it to do. It didn't dodge. It didn't run away. It shot back. Think about how big that is for a second. On one side, a military power that spent 4 years and billions of dollars, building the densest anti-drone defense on the planet. On the other side, a drone that costs less than an economy car, carrying a rocket whose roots go back to the 1940s. Yes, from the time of World War II. And this old weapon is breaking through the most expensive defense on the planet. That very defense that has plenty of radar, missiles, and electronic warfare. And when you understand how it's breaking through the Russian defense, you'll realize that Putin has plenty of reasons to be worried. Let's start with the scene that started it all. On May 12th of last year, open source analysts shared a video recorded over occupied Crimea. In it, a long-range Ukrainian drone crosses the sky. And it does something that no attack drone of this type had done before. It releases a rocket from under its wing, aiming at a Russian target on the ground, and then continues flying toward its main mission. It attacked along the way and kept going. Those who saw it first understood what that meant for the rest of the war. The leaked images came from Russian sources, and the identification marks on the rockets were covered. The Ukrainian defense analysis only suggested that they were old Soviet rockets, but there was no definitive visual confirmation. But days later, the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces himself, Robert Brovdy, known by the codename Madyar, published videos of these rocket attacks launched from drones. The concept had been revealed, but there was still one thing left to understand. Not what the rocket was, but where it had come from. And that's where the surprise lies. This weapon is not new at all. It's older than most people watching this video. It's the S-5, an unguided 57mm rocket whose origins go back to 1946, when Soviet engineers began studying German rockets captured at the end of World War II. It took years before it became a real weapon. It only entered service in the mid-50s. And it was created for a completely different purpose than today, to shoot down bomber formations, fired by jet fighters. Later, it became a close support weapon for Soviet aviation. It was used in Afghanistan, and there it gained a reputation for being inaccurate. It spread so much after being fired that pilots said it was good for little more than scaring the enemy. Its bigger brother, the S-8 with 80mm, entered service in the 80s with a much more capable warhead. One of its versions is capable of piercing 4 finger widths of solid steel armor. These are old, cheap weapons from an era that seemed to be over. So why bring back such an old rocket? The answer? well, it's less romantic than it seems. According to the chief designer of the manufacturer, one of the reasons for the modification was simply surplus. Ukraine had a huge stockpile of these rockets left over, sitting unused. It wasn't a stroke of genius. It was looking at a warehouse full of unused ammunition and asking, what if we found a way to use this? The genius isn't in the rocket, it's where it ended up, because Ukraine has had these rockets since the beginning of the war, and they were already trying to use them. At the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian planes and helicopters fired these rockets at Russian positions in the east of the country in the traditional way, and they paid a high price for it. To use an unguided rocket, the aircraft needs to get close to the target. And getting close in the skies over Ukraine meant entering the range of Russian anti-aircraft systems. Pantsir, the portable missiles that the soldier fires from his shoulder. The Torn Book systems. In other words, the weapon existed, but any platform capable of carrying it was shot down along the way. The rocket was waiting for something that could get close without being destroyed. And that something wouldn't be a plane with a pilot inside. It would be a drone, cheap, disposable, that no one would cry over if it went down. Keep that idea in mind, because it's the key to everything that's coming next. And what's coming next is the most important part. Why is this so devastating for Russia, specifically? To understand, we need to climb the ladder that Russia built and see how each step collapsed. The first step was electronic warfare. Russia set up the densest electronic interference environment in modern history, designed to blind Ukrainian drones, scramble satellite positioning signals, cut off the radio link the operator uses to control the drone, and jam the sensors. For a while it worked. Drones would lose video mid-flight and crash. The Ukrainian response was almost improvised. The fiber optic drone. Instead of radio, a wire thinner than a human hair unrolls behind the drone as it flies, carrying control and video as pulses of light. With no radio signal, there's nothing to jam. The drone passes through the electronic storm as if it doesn't exist. First step neutralized. The second step was the missiles. Systems like the Pantsir, a mobile platform on a truck that Russia claimed was the best in the world for shooting down low-flying drones. The problem is that the Pantsir was made for bigger and higher targets. Against small, cheap drones that are almost invisible to radar, it proved to be too expensive and ineffective. And the numbers tell the story on their own. Just last year, Ukraine claims to have destroyed more than 130 Russian air defense systems. Some reports mention up to 170. An independent group that only counts what can be visually verified has recorded dozens of destroyed Pantsirs. Ukraine says it has eliminated about half of Russia's stock. But notice what Russia itself has started to do. They began taking Soviet-era radars from storage, ones that are half a century old, like the P-18, and cobbling together systems using modified missiles. Magyar himself said that one of those radars was mounted on such an old truck that he barely recognized it. A Russian military blogger admitted the obvious. To manufacture missiles. It's physically impossible to produce Pantsir missiles at the rate they're being lost. Second step, collapsing. And then we reach the last step. When expensive technology failed, Russia went back to basics. If radar and missiles can't stop the drone, then put people on the ground to shoot it down by sight. Mobile fire teams were created. Small teams positioned along the drone approach routes, armed with machine guns, but also, for the most part, with rifles and sniper rifles with thermal sights to see in the dark. They are hunters. Men lying in the cold, watching the night sky through a scope that turns heat into an image, waiting for the hot spot of a drone's engine to appear. It was the most primitive defense of all, and because it was primitive, it was also the hardest to defeat. After all, you can't fool a man with a rifle. It was the only thing Russia still had standing, and that's exactly what's falling now. To understand why it's falling, you need to see the difference that changes everything. Watch closely. All previous Ukrainian adaptations let the drone slip through. The fiber optic drone passes by unnoticed. The drone that loses signal just falls. The logic was always to evade the defense. The drone armed with a rocket reverses this logic for the first time. It doesn't run from the hunter. When it encounters the Russian team along the way, it fires rockets designed to hit ground troops and heads toward the target. The difference is brutal and it's simple. A jammed drone falls without injuring anyone. An armed drone fights back. And, not by chance, Commander Madyar himself said very clearly that these drones were designed specifically for mobile teams with portable missiles. And the machine gunners who guard the Russian anti-aircraft defenses. The last layer of Russian defense worked because it was people. And people can't be hacked, but people can be targeted. And that's why it all comes down to this. Russia didn't swap one weapon for a better one. It was left without the next layer. They used up the electronics, used up the missiles, bet on the men, and now the men are also under fire. There's no step below this one left. And the point here isn't necessarily to eliminate the Russian team. It's enough to force them to hide, to change position, to stop working long enough for the other drones to get through. Until then, Ukraine's deep strikes had always been limited less by distance and more by the corridor of defenses between the front line and the target. Every drone that crosses that corridor is an operation. The armed drone doesn't solve this problem entirely, but it lowers the cost of each crossing. And it became clear right after that this works. On May 17th, Ukraine itself released a video of these drones hitting a strategic communications center of the Russian Black Sea Fleet in occupied Crimea. Protected military infrastructure hit by a drone that now also carries rockets to clear a path to it. Have you ever stopped to think where this is going to end? Has Ukraine shown this scenario somewhere else before? Have you ever heard of Magura? This naval drone started out as an explosive-laden drone boat designed to crash into Russian ships. Russia responded by sending helicopters to hunt the boats before they arrived. The Ukrainian response was to arm their own boat with air-to-air missiles. And at the end of 2024, Ukrainian intelligence claimed to have shot down a Russian helicopter with one of these boats. Yes, a boat shooting down an aircraft. It was such a shock that Russia practically stopped sending helicopters to hunt these drones, relying only on fast fighter jets instead. And then came the next version of the boat with even more capable missiles which, the following year, shot down 2 Russian fighter jets in the air. It's the same logic as the rocket-equipped drone, a single-purpose platform that encounters a specific defense and gets exactly the weapon needed to overcome that defense without losing its original function. The next step already being discussed in Ukrainian defense circles is to replace the dumb rocket with a guided rocket, capable of pursuing moving targets. And this is where things get bigger than rockets and drones. Notice what really happened in these 4 years. Back in 2022, it was Russia who was leading. It was Russia that used fiber optic drones first, and Ukraine copied it within a month. It was Russia that developed electronic warfare against drones. The technical advantage was theirs. But now the advantage has switched sides. Today, Ukraine unveils a new launcher, and Russia takes only a few days to find it in the field, but it can no longer respond at the same pace. And if you really look at it, that's the real problem underneath it all. Because in a war like this, technological advantage isn't something you own, it's something you borrow. Whoever is ahead today might be playing catch-up tomorrow. And what decides it isn't who has the best equipment, it's who adapts faster. The Russian wall didn't fall because Ukraine invented a magic weapon. It fell because Ukraine dismantled each layer at the same speed that Russia could build it, and then even faster. As you can see, Russia used up all the cards it had: electronic warfare, missiles, boots on the ground. They had nothing left up their sleeve. Every new solution has been identified, copied, and overcome even before it spreads across the entire front. And this race isn't going to stop here. Now put the pieces together. The bridge that Putin inaugurated by driving a truck now hardly carries anything anymore. The ferries are at the bottom of the sea. The last road has become a graveyard for trucks. Fuel doesn't get through. The fleet fled from Sevastopol and is hiding inside its own ports. And even the sky, once shielded by the most expensive anti-air defense on the planet, now belongs to the Ukrainian drones. The truth is that Crimea will not fall in a massive tank attack. It's turning into an island, too expensive to hold, impossible to supply, impossible to defend. The trophy that proved Putin had rebuilt the empire has become the weight that could sink him. In 2014, Putin took Crimea in 4 weeks, almost without a shot being fired. 12 years later, it may be lost in exactly the same way, without an invasion, without a major battle. Just the slow squeeze from those who have cut off every route back. And when the last one is cut off, the Russian soldiers inside will be the last to know. If this analysis made you see the war in a different way, leave a like. And comment down below, will Crimea become Ukrainian again by 2026? Subscribe to the channel, we'll cover each step of this downfall. See you in the next video.